Hey Furies. So there I was, bouncing ideas back and forth with our Supreme Leader Mishka when he asked one of the great questions of our time. What about dragons? To which I answered, that's a fantastic question. In Avatar, dragons are ancient, mysterious creatures, and we only ever meet two of them, Ran and Shaw in the episode The Firebending Masters, though Druk also appears later on in Legend of Korra with Zuko. But I started to wonder about their origins, where they came from, what exactly they are, because there's a number of interesting details that tell us that there's a lot more to them than we're explicitly told. So one of the things that has always puzzled me about the lore, and this is intimately tied into the discussion around dragons, is where is the Sun Spirit? So in the Winter Solstice Part 1, we're introduced to Heibai, the spirit of a scorched forest outside Senlin Village. In the Great Divide, we hear of Earth Spirits who presided over the canyons, and most importantly, during the Siege of the North, we're introduced to the Moon and Ocean Spirits. The show and the creators, as I've read a lot about in this beautiful Avatar art book, have made clear that they took a lot from Eastern folklore and religion surrounding spirits, that they embody and protect elements of the physical world. So it begs the question, why is there no sun spirit? Not only do we have spirits for forests and rivers and other celestial bodies like the moon, but there's not even a mention of a sun spirit throughout the entire series. I would know, I checked the transcripts. What a life I live, reading Avatar transcripts. Message from Head Clone Office. Oh, thank you. This just says a sad life. But this is a little odd, because the sun seems like a pretty important thing to have in the universe, right? Why would they miss it out? Except, what if there are sun spirits, and we've just been missing them all along? The dragons. In the episode The Firebending Masters, Aang and Zuko go to the Sun Warriors to meet the original Firebending Masters, who turn out to be Ran and Shaw, two dragons. But the experience that they have with them tell us that these beings aren't just mere animals like Komodo rhinos or platypus bears.
They will examine you. They'll read your hearts, your souls, and your ancestry. They judged you and gave you visions of the meaning of firebending.
The dragons were capable of making character judgments of who is worthy and who is not, of setting tests for their applicants so that they do the dancing dragon with them. They're clearly meant to be ancient, mysterious beings capable of intelligent thought, which sets them apart from animals to a large extent. But this alone isn't enough to say that they're sun spirits. What has always been curious to me is that they're recognized as the original firebenders.
Zuko needs to go back to whatever the original source of firebending is.
The original firebenders were the dragons, and they're extinct.
Now, there's nothing odd about having animals or mortal creatures as the original benders. I mean, after all, the sky bison are the original airbenders, and badger moles are the original earthbenders. So there is some confusion around if that is true, then how did the lion turtles give humanity bending? If you want that cleared up, then click the link up in the corner of the screen. I made a video about that a while ago. No, what struck me as strange is that there's clearly a more obvious answer for the original source of firebending. The sun. Let's break that down for a moment. The episode is all about Zuko and Aang going to find the original meaning, the original expression and philosophy behind firebending. Listen to this description.
I saw so many colors. Colors I've never imagined.
All this time, I thought firebending was destruction. But now I know what it really is. It's energy and life.
Yeah, it's like the sun.
This is what firebending is meant to be, and they say it came from the dragons, but what's interesting is that we can tell from their architecture, to their apparel, to their culture, that the Sun Warriors are based on, and I can tell you for sure with reference to my beautiful Avatar art book, that the designers looked to Mayan ruins for inspiration for the Sun Warriors culture. You can look at the Sun Warriors and definitely see the influence of the Mayan civilization. And this ties in with the discussion because the Mayans placed a special importance on their sun god, Kini Ahas, which, by the way, I do realize I'm taking a cleaver to the Mayan language and butchering that pronunciation. The philosophy espoused in the episode around the original meaning of firebending fits perfectly with how the Mayans viewed the sun, as the ultimate source of life, of light, of energy, and fire. It would make sense for the Sun Warriors to revere the sun, not just dragons, with how all this fits together. And the episode itself does seem to support this analysis, and this is where we need to talk about the point that has probably already occurred to most of you. The civilization itself is called what? The Sun Warriors, and they're described in this way.
The first people to learn from the dragons were the ancient Sun Warriors. No, they died off thousands of years ago.
So their traditions and ideas go right back, or as far back as possible, to the beginning of firebending. And as we've discussed, it would make sense for them to revere the sun as the original firebender. Thing is, when I watched the episode, I realized they kind of already did. without ever saying it. Their apparel repeatedly uses the image of the sun, one of their sacred treasures is known as the Sunstone, and their architecture is designed to take account of the patterns of the sun in the sky.
I bet that sunstone opens the door, but only when sunlight hits it at just the right angle.
Everything in their civilization recalls the imagery of the sun, right down to their name, the Sun Warriors. And on top of this, the altar of the Firebending Masters is built to frame the sunset perfectly, and we see that in the show. Even if they never say it, everything about their civilization draws a parallel between the sun and dragons as the original firebenders, to say they're equally important. They even call their way of firebending
The ways of the sun.
the way of the sun. So the question becomes, how could they have forgotten this? Forgotten the sun? Well, the episode does seem to imply a lot about what has happened to Fire Nation culture over time. Let's not forget that everyone, including Zuko, the crowned prince of the Fire Nation, believed that the Sun Warriors, and I quote,
They died off thousands of years ago.
and though we do learn that they're still alive, there aren't many of them left. The culture has tried to survive for thousands of years on fumes alone. Much of who they were, their beliefs, their knowledge, their values from ages past would have been lost over time. And I think their belief in the sun as the original firebender may have been lost with that. But how would things come to this, Tim? Great question, you overzealous iron fiction. I think that the sun spirit did the same as we learned the moon and the ocean spirits did. So when Aang goes to TwotheFuture in the season 1 finale, which reminds me that I need to make that video on whether and how spirits reproduce. Thank you, Daniel, and 10 points to anyone who's been around here long enough to know what I'm referring to. Roku explains,
They crossed over from the spirit world to the mortal world, very near the beginning.
the moon and the ocean are described as ancient, somewhat primordial spirits, and it would make perfect sense for the sun to fall into the same category. I mean, the moon and the sun are both vital celestial bodies that hang in the sky, and so it's my theory that just as the moon and the ocean spirits crossed over into the mortal world to take the form of koi fish, the sun spirit crossed over to take the form of dragons, that they all took on mortal forms. But what's notable is that the water tribes clearly forgot that the koi fish sitting in their spirit oasis were the moon and the ocean. Kind of an important thing to forget, you think? Oh, I say, that's quite a nice fish pond you have there. That? Oh, they're just the physical embodiment of the primordial forces of the universe. Ew. With the Sun Warriors nearly dying out and their values being passed down through just a small group of people, it's likely that just the same, the exact identity of the original Firebender could have been lost to time. Oh, the imagery of the sun would have been carried on in their traditions and their architecture as a remnant of times past. Though, instead of them forgetting the mortal form of the spirit like with the Northern Water Tribe, they would forget that the dragons were the mortal form of that sun spirit. Over time, it would make sense that they equated the two, that they gradually accepted the dragons, the things that they could interact with, and see literally creating fire as the original firebenders, and the sun would sort of just fade from memory. But there's actually a lot more evidence that dragons are from the spirit world than just this. Firstly, dragons can do something that only spirits can do. They can appear in the spirit world. So in the Winter Solstice Part 1, we meet Roku's dragon Fang. He has a translucent blue spirit form like many of the other spirits that we see. And I soon realized this was unusual because animals don't go to the spirit world. We have never seen any other animal go there after they die, and they certainly can't just go there or meditate there of their own free will. This ability does imply that they have something of a greater spiritual affinity. Though I actually have an alternate theory on why Fang ended up in the spirit world, and it's all to do with the relationship between the Avatar and their animal guides. If you want to check that out, it's one of my favorite videos that I actually have ever done. Click the link up in the corner of the screen. Another detail to consider is that the creators actually drew a parallel between the moon and the ocean spirits and the dragons. The creators designed both the moon and the ocean and the dragons to move in a yin and yang fashion, around and together with one another. And this does hold some significance, because the yin-yang symbols in Taoist philosophy don't just refer to the moon. The yang symbol actually refers to the sun. So that spiritual link, that thematic imagery is repeated again. Just as the koi fish were associated with the moon, the dragons may be associated with the sun. And the second point, the powers and intelligence of dragons. In the Winter Solstice Part 1, Fang touches Aang on the forehead and gives him a vision. And in the Firebending Masters, though we never saw any vision, the chief describes,
They judged you and gave you visions of the meaning of firebending.
I thought about it for a while, but I couldn't think of any animals in the Avatar world that have powers of that kind. Like, you've got badger moles which have the ability to earthbend, but it doesn't really tend to get into sort of the spiritual side of things, ever. But you know who do? Spirits, whether they're in their mortal form, like the ocean, or their immortal form, like Heibai. And as we discussed before, they're incredibly intelligent and wise creatures. Dragons are clearly sentient and powerful in a way that is far more akin to a spirit than it is to an animal. And there is another little point that I want to touch on from a very, very short clip in The Legend of Korra, the episode Beginnings Part 1. This is where one has the element of fire, but he's learning how to use it. Learning from who? A dragon. And we can see one doing the dancing dragon, a set of firebending stances that we also see Zuko and Aang learn. But what's interesting is that the dragon isn't hanging around alone, it's hanging around with other spirits, suggesting that to me it has more of a connection to the spirit world than it does to the physical or mortal animal world. Though I don't place too much emphasis on this point. I didn't really think there was a huge amount there, but I did want to mention it because it is one of the other times that we do see a dragon in this series. And it's an interesting side note that I want to touch on. So we know that the show took a lot from Eastern mythology, religion, folklore, but the dragons in the show breathe fire, which is actually more of a Western idea associated with dragons. In Eastern mythology, dragons are more associated with water. If dragons are the embodiment of the sun, then that would explain why they're associated with fire rather than water. But there is one more thing that I want to explore with this theory, which is that obviously when the moon spirit's koi fish, its mortal form, was killed, it also killed the moon, which, you know, isn't that great a thing for the world. But we know that dragons were hunted down and killed till Ren and Shaw were the last ones remaining for a long time. But still, the sun remained shining brightly. Remember?
I discovered a hidden library. One of them contained a detailed illustration and the words moon and ocean. I knew then that these spirits could be found and killed.
But the thing is that we don't really know what a spirit taking mortal form really entails. What is involved? Do they need to eat? Do they need to sleep? Do they need to reproduce? In the Siege of the North, we see that Tui and La need water to survive, so maybe it's impossible to say for sure. But in this case, the sun's mortal form does reproduce, and we know that dragon eggs are a thing in the Avatar universe. There's a short comic where Aang and his Fire Nation friend Kuzon find a dragon egg, and I don't really have any problem with that. I mean, after all, they did choose to become mortal. But that is all from me. If you like what I do, or love and adore our Supreme Leader Mishka, or you want to see upcoming videos, help decide topics, get videos earlier than everyone else, then Patreon is definitely one way to support us. And there's a link to that down in the description below. Question of the day: what is one conspiracy that you kind of believe, even if just like a little bit? Let me know down in the comments below. In the meantime, I'd love if you can follow me over on Twitter or Facebook, email myself your main address and links in the description below. Stay nerdy, Sub Furies, and I'll see you in the future.